I thanked them and went off to find the advocate. Bingara was an oddly interesting little town. It was small and half dead and on a road to nowhere, yet it had not only a tourist office but also its own newspaper. At the advocate office I was told that Paulette Smith had popped out and that I should try back in an hour. Slightly at a loss, I went into a cafe and ordered a sandwich and a coffee and was mindlessly consuming both when a woman, red-haired, late 30ish and looking faintly breathless, abruptly slid onto the seat facing me. "I hear you're looking for me," she said. I smiled. "News travels fast here." She rolled her eyes ironically. "Small town." Paulette Smith was rather intense, but with a sudden, disarming smile that would flash at odd moments, like a broken sign, and then be lost at once in a greater intensity of what she was telling me. "We didn't learn anything about the massacre when I was growing up," she said. We knew it had happened, that a long time ago some Aborigines were killed out by the creek, and that some white people were hanged for it, but that was about it. We weren't taught about it in school. We didn't, make school trips out there or anything. The smile came and went. Did people talk about it? No, never. I asked her where exactly it happened. Nobody knows. Somewhere on Myall Creek Station. Station in the context means a farm or ranch. It's all private property now, and they are not real friendly to trespassers. It's owned by a businessman from Sydney as a kind of hobby farm. He's not, you might say, too interested in a historical connection. So there's never been any kind of archaeological dig or anything? You didn't get academics poking about? No, there's not that kind of interest in it. Anyway, I don't think they'd know where to look. It's a big property. And there's no memorial of any kind? Oh no. Isn't that odd? Not especially. But wouldn't you expect the government to put up something? She considered for a moment. Well, you've got to understand there was nothing all that special about Myall Creek. Aborigines were slaughtered all over the place. 3 months before the Myall massacre, 200 Aborigines were killed at Waterloo Creek, near Moray. Moray was 60 miles or so farther west. Nobody was ever punished for that. They didn't even try to punish anybody for that. I didn't know that. She nodded. No reason why you should. Most people have never heard of it. All that was different about Myall Creek was that white people were punished for it. It didn't stop them killing Aborigines. It just made them more circumspect. They didn't boast about it in the pub afterwards. Another flickering smile. It's kind of ironic when you think about it. Myall Creek's not famous for what happened to the blacks here, but for what happened to the whites. Anyway, you wouldn't be able to move in this country for memorials if you try to acknowledge them all. She stared dreamily for a moment at my notebook, then said abruptly, "I have to get back to work." She made an apologetic look. "I'm afraid I haven't been much help." "No, you've been a great help," I said. Then I thought of another question. "Are there any Aborigines here now?" "Oh no, They're long gone from round here. I paid for my lunch and returned to the car. On the way out of town, I stopped again by the bridge and wandered a little way up an overgrown lane and that led onto part of the station property. But there was nothing to see, and I was little afraid of snakes in the tall grass. So I returned to the car and retraced my route across the dusty plain and on toward the distant blue slopes of the Great Dividing Range. And so to Surfers Paradise, back on the Pacific Coast Highway and another 100 miles north. Surfers Paradise is just over the border in Queensland, and I was eager to dig a toe into that interesting and erratic state. In a country where states are both few and immense, the arrival in a new one is always an event. I wasn't going to come this far and not at least slip over the border. One thing you find if you browse much through non-fiction works of Australia is that practically every book written about the country in the last 40 years, possibly more, has in it somewhere an anecdote illustrating that Queenslanders are not like other people. In Australian Paradox, Jean Mackenzie relates the story of an American guest at rural Queensland hotel in the 1950s who was presented at dinner with a plate of cold meat and potatoes. He stared with private disappointment at the offering for a moment, then diffidently inquired whether he might have a little salad with it. The waitress, Miss Mackenzie reports, looked at him with astonishment and disdain and, turning to the other guests, remarked, "The bastard thinks it's Christmas." Here's another that I have read twice. A visitor, French in one version, English in the other, is staying at a Queensland hotel during the rainy season that is a feature of life in northern Australia. The guest is startled upon reaching his room to discover that it is flooded to a depth of 3 or 4 inches. When he reports this at the front desk, the owner looks at him with pain and irritation and says, "Well, the bed's dry, isn't it?" All these stories have certain things in common. Generally, they take place in the 1950s. Generally, they involve a foreign visitor at a rural hotel. Generally, they are presented as true. And always they make Queenslanders look like bricks. Most suggest that Queenslanders are just crazy, and the evidence does rather point in that direction. For almost 2 decades, the state was under the control of John Bjork Peterson, an eccentric right-wing state premier who at one time seriously entertained the notion of blowing up parts of the Great Barrier Reef with small atomic bombs to create shipping channels. Of late, it had gained fame as the seat of a politician named Pauline Hanson, a fish and chips shop owner who had started a right-wing anti-immigration party called One Nation, which had had a spell of striking success before it became evident even to her most ardent followers that Miss Hanson was a little, shall we say, cerebrally singular. She wrote a book in which she suggested that Aborigines engaged in cannibalism and produced an interestingly paranoid video which began, "Fellow Australians, if you're seeing me now, it means I have been murdered." Her seat was the Brisbane suburb of Oxley, which inspired some genius to dub her the Oxley Moron. In a word, Queensland has a reputation for being a place apart. I couldn't wait to get there. In 1933, Elston, Queensland was a remote and inconsequential seaside hamlet with an excellent beach, a few flimsy cottages, a popular but slightly raffish hotel, and a couple of shops. Then the town fathers got a really good idea. Realizing that nobody was going to travel hundreds of miles to visit a place called Elston, and more to the point that nobody was traveling hundreds of miles to visit a place called Elston, they decided to give the place a peppier name based on something novel and upbeat. Looking around, their gaze fell on the local hotel. It was called Surfers Paradise. The sport had just become popular in Australia. The name had a certain ring. They decided to give it a try and see what happened. The town has never looked back. Today, Surfers Paradise is famous, while its neighboring resort communities, Broadbeach, Currumbin, Tagan, Kirra, Billinga, are scarcely known outside Queensland. It hardly matters because they have all coalesced into a single unsightly sprawl stretching for 30 miles from the Queensland-New South Wales border almost to Brisbane. The whole is called the Gold Coast. This is Australia's Florida. You see it now before you see it long before you get to it. Shimmering towers of glass and concrete rising beside the sea and snaking off down the coastline to a distant, hazy vanishing point. When Jean Mackenzie passed this way in 1959, not one bit of this glitziness existed. Surfers Paradise was still a low-key, low-rise, old-fashioned sort of place. In 1962, it got its first high-rise. Another followed a year or two later, then another. By the end of the 60s, half a dozen 10 or 12-story buildings stood awkwardly and a little self-consciously along the front. Then in the early 1970s, a development frenzy started. Where once there were just sandy quarter-acre plots, each holding a matchbox beach cottage, today stand hotels of Trump-like splendor, balconied apartment towers, a domed casino, verdant golf courses, water parks, amusement parks, miniature golf courses, shopping malls, and all the rest. Much of this, you are told in a confidential tone, was built and paid for with money of dubious pedigree. People outside Queensland will tell you that the Gold Coast is rife with unsavory elements. Australian drug barons, Japanese yakuza, flashy linchpins of the Hong Kong triads. This is not, you are led to believe, a place to bump a Mercedes and start an argument. Nearly everyone you meet elsewhere in Australia will tell you, "Oh, you must see the Gold Coast. It's awful." "Really?" you say, intrigued. "In what way?" "I don't know exactly. I've never been there myself." "Well, obviously. But it's like Have you seen Muriel's Wedding? No. Well, it's like that. Just like it, apparently. So I was interested on many levels to see the Gold Coast and disappointed on nearly every one of them. To begin with, it wasn't tacky at all. It was just another large, impersonal, well-provisioned international resort. I could have been in Marbella or Eilat or any place else developed in the last 25 years. The hotels were mostly big international names, Marriott, Radisson, Mercure, and of an unexceptionally respectable standard. I parked the car on a side street and walked along to the seafront. En route, I passed stores of an unexpected ritziness, Prada, Hermes, Ralph Lauren, all perfectly fine. It just wasn't very interesting. I didn't need to travel 8,000 miles to look at Ralph Lauren bath towels. The beach, however, was exceedingly splendid, broad, clean, sunny, with lazy, manageable-sized waves rolling in from an almost painfully blue and bright sea. The air was filled with salt tang and the ozone-enriched shrieks of pleasure and children shouting and a sense of people having fun. I took a seat on a bench and just watched people enjoying themselves. I had read somewhere that the Gold Coast beaches are actually quite treacherous for rips. As it happened, drownings were much in the news lately. Australian media cover beach mishaps the way American papers cover blizzards and hurricanes, as a seasonal event involving lots of comparative statistics. According to the papers, there had been 34 drownings already this year, more than most years, and the summer wasn't yet half over. Much of it was blamed on tourists who didn't know how to read the water for rips or to stay calm when they were caught in one. But a lot of it was just down to lunacy. The Sydney Morning Herald cited the case of a 52-year-old man at a place called North Avoca Beach who had sternly cautioned people not to swim at the particular spot, then went in himself and drowned. Just that morning, while packing up at my motel, I had paused to watch a lifeguard from here at Surfers Paradise being interviewed on a breakfast television program. He said that he himself had rescued 100 people the previous week, including one tourist whom he had saved twice. Twice, said the interviewer. The lifeguard grinned at the ridiculousness of it. Yep. What? You saved him and he went back in the water and you had to save him again? The grin broadened. Yep. I scanned the water for troubled swimmers. I couldn't imagine how any lifeguard could spot a drowning person among all the hundreds of happy, frolicking bodies, but they most assuredly do. Australian lifeguards are unquestionably the finest in the world. In the same period that 34 people drowned, more than 6,000 was saved, a commendable ratio to say the very least. Eventually, I stopped for a cup of coffee and then wandered through the business district, but Surfers Paradise was mostly just a succession of stores selling the same stuff: painted boomerangs and didgeridoos, cuddly toy koalas and kangaroos, postcards and souvenir books, rack upon rack of t-shirts, in one of the shops, I bought a postcard that showed a kangaroo surfing and asked the young lady who served me if she knew where the original Surfers Paradise Hotel was. "Oh, I don't know," she said, and looked guilty, as if she had forgotten a secret with which she had been entrusted. "I haven't been in the area very long," she added. I nodded that it didn't matter and asked where she was from. ACT. Seeing my mind varying to little effect, she added, "Australian Capital Territory, Canberra." "Of course. So which is better?" I asked. "Canberra or Surfers Paradise?" "Oh, Surfers by a mile." I raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that good, is it?" It's that good, is it?" "Oh no," she said emphatically, amazed that I had misread her. "Canberra's that bad." I smiled at her solemnly. She nodded with conviction. "I reckon if you were going to rank things for how much pleasure they give, Canberra would come somewhere below breaking your arm." I grinned and she grinned too. "Well, at least with a broken arm it will get there. It will get better." She talked with the rising intonation common to young people in Australia, which turns every statement into a question. It drives older Australians crazy, but personally I find it endearing and sometimes, as here, charmingly sexy. A supervisor-type person came over to make sure we weren't enjoying ourselves too much. Can I be of assistance?" she said in an odd accent that suggested long devotion to a book titled Elocution Self-Taught. She held her head at an odd angle too, tilted back slightly as if she were afraid that her eyeballs might fall out. "I was looking for the original Surfers Paradise Hotel." "Ah, that was torn down some years ago." She flashed a satisfied smile. "It reminded me exactly of William F. Buckley." I'm not sure it wasn't William F. Buckley, though whether the smile indicated that she was happy that it had been torn down or merely pleased to be able to convey disappointing news, I couldn't say. She showed me on the map in my guidebook where it had stood. I thanked them both and, clutching my directions, found my way to the site of the famous and now irretrievably lost Surfers Paradise Hotel. Today the spot is occupied by a shopping complex called the Paradise Center, which was much more in keeping with the modern resort in that it was ugly and filled with overpriced crap. In the Surfers Paradise book I had consulted in Adelaide, a photograph from the late 1940s had shown a delightfully ramshacked hotel, a place that looked as if it had been built in phases with whatever materials had come to hand, with a terrace bar on which sat many people soaking up sunshine and alcohol in careless volumes and looking awfully pleased to be there. I walked all the way around the block, then stood on the opposite corner and stared at the site for a long time, but it wasn't possible to imagine it as it had been, any more than it was possible to imagine the Mayo Creek massacre from its present peaceful situation. So I returned to the car and headed out of town through the dappled stripes of sun and shade created by the big hotels and lavish palm trees. At the edge of town, I rejoined the Pacific Highway and headed south. I had a long drive to Sydney ahead of me. For the moment, my trip was over, but I would be back, of course. I wasn't anywhere near finished with this place yet.